Hey friends, welcome back. This is Class 5, Session 5. Now in the last class we dealt with the subject of the ancient Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions concerning the location of Mount Sinai, and we showed that there is this very clear, very unbroken chain of tradition that goes all the way back to the Septuagint, to the 3rd century BC, well over 600 years prior to anything that turns up with regard to the traditional site. And we showed that it was fairly universally recognized to be, Mount Sinai was recognized to be over there in northwest Saudi Arabia, the area today that is northwest Saudi Arabia. In ancient times, of course, it was just outside of the town or the city of Midian, which is today called Al-Bad or Al-Bid. Again, in northwest Saudi Arabia. So in covering that material, we mentioned in passing that Paul the Apostle, just this huge looming witness in the middle of all of this, clearly also would have agreed with his contemporaries, both Jewish and the Christians that came shortly after him, and would have also placed Mount Sinai there in northwest Saudi Arabia. However, because this topic of Paul the Apostle and what he believed specifically is such an important and really such a big topic, I thought it was important to take a whole class to address it. So briefly, by way of introduction, you have two statements in Paul's pastoral epistle to the Galatians. You have two statements that Paul makes, and they're two different statements, two sort of separate points, two separate arguments. They are interrelated. We're going to deal with the second of the statements first, and then we're going to come back to the first one. So the first one is found there in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 17. And this is where Paul is talking about his conversion experience, his road to Damascus experience where Jesus knocks him on his duff and just turns his world upside down. And in that, Paul says, he makes this statement, he says, listen, after I had this experience, I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't consult with man. I didn't consult with any flesh. I didn't consult with the other apostles. Rather, I went to Arabia. So we're going to discuss what that means at the end of this class. But first, we're going to discuss another statement that Paul made in Galatians chapter 4, verse 25. And this is where Paul is discussing he's discussing the covenants, he's discussing Jerusalem, he's discussing a few things. He's making a very, very biblical, very, as Paul often does, very nuanced, even you could say rabbinic argument. And in the middle of this argument, which we'll deal with here, he makes the statement and he says, Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Okay, now, because in the last class we saw that in the Septuagint, that in the writings of Philo, again an Alexandrian Jew, as well as in the writings of Josephus, a Jerusalemite, a Jew from Jerusalem, that because there was this well-known, well-understood tradition in Paul's day, as well as, again, carried on by the Christians after Paul, in the writings of Demetrius and Origen, Eusebius, and Jerome, we have no reason whatsoever to believe that Paul held to a contrary position. We have no evidence, historically, contextually, or otherwise, to believe that Paul would have believed something very different than these traditions which were common in Paul's day. Okay? Now, because of this, traditionalists, again, those who want to place Mount Sinai there in the southern Sinai Peninsula, they recognize that Paul's statement is a huge problem. They understand that it's really an insurmountable problem for the traditionalist perspective, and therefore they have thrown up a huge smokescreen. This is what we call the fog of scholarship. If you don't have a good answer, you just wax eloquently and write about a 30-page paper on something and try to confuse people and just throw up a big smokescreen, and people go, wow, this guy's a scholar and he's saying a lot of things that I don't quite understand, but he must have a point, so therefore I'm not a scholar. I have to just defer to his intelligence. This is, I hate to say it, but this is a common technique. When I see somebody, as they say, brevity is the soul of wit. In other words, the ability to articulate something briefly is the essence, it's the foundation of intelligence. When I see someone who needs, 35 pages to explain something which should be easily explainable, then I know that they are hemming and hawing and trying to essentially throw up a smoke screen. So essentially, the argument that virtually all of the traditionalists make, and I've seen it repeated over and over and over. It's always the same. Essentially, it goes like this. First, the claim is made that the common understanding of the term, of the word, Arabia, in Paul's day would have included the Sinai Peninsula. Now, first of all, I agree with that. We agree with that. However, there's much more. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and we're going to explain why. And then from there, okay, so that's the first point. They go, listen, in Paul's day, the Sinai Peninsula would have been considered Arabia just as well as the Arabian Peninsula, i.e. today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as all of the Emirates, the Arabian Peninsula, that giant peninsula to the west and south of Israel versus that little pie-shaped peninsula called the Sinai Peninsula. So traditionalists, they go, no, the Sinai Peninsula would have also, the entirety of it, they say all of it, would have been considered Arabia. Now, I don't entirely agree with that, but I do agree that part of it most likely would have been understood or viewed as being part of Arabia. However, it's not quite as simple as they make it out to be. There's a little bit more. We're going to dig under the surface a little bit. But the second point is they say, therefore, that's what Paul must have been referring to. Therefore, that's clearly what Paul was pointing to. Now, I think anybody watching this will recognize that even if the first point is true, the second point does not follow logically. In fact, it's a completely illogical, unsubstantiated argument. So as an example, James Hoffmeyer, I'm going to read a quote from him directly. He begins by asserting this. He says, the term Arabia, as used in Greco-Roman times, included the Sinai. Again, we partially agree with him on this, and this is not the point that we are arguing about. However, then he continues, and he says, hence, okay, therefore, Paul is plainly using the geographical term that was understood in his day to refer to Sinai. Okay, so first he says the Sinai was included. Notice the operative word here is included. So among all of the various options in terms of what Arabia could have meant, he says Sinai is included in that. It's one of them. Therefore, that must be what he's talking about. That is illogical. That does not work. That is a bad argument, a fundamentally flawed argument. And then again, they'll wax eloquently, and write for pages and pages and try to, quote all sorts of Greco-Roman historians and geographers and so forth and sort of throw you off and go, but wait a minute, back at the very beginning of this argument, you made a fundamentally illogical statement which doesn't work. Let's go back to that. Let's deal with that because that undermines virtually everything else that you're saying. Likewise, Gordon Franz, again, as I've mentioned, probably the most vocal, the individual that has written the most critically concerning the location of Jebel al-Lawz, he argues this. This is how he says it. He says, the Galatians 4:25 reference might indeed support the view that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabia if Paul the Apostle was looking at a 1990 Rand McNally atlas. However, it would not be true if he was looking at a 1st century AD roadmap. So again, a statement like this, it's purposefully intended and crafted to throw legitimate truth seekers off of the scent of truth. Okay, because he goes, look, there's no way that Paul, when he said Arabia in Galatians 4:25, there's no way he was pointing to Saudi Arabia unless he lived in the 1990s and he was looking at a modern day map. The problem with that is that, yes, of course, back in Paul's day, it was not called Saudi Arabia. However, geography does not change. And there is nothing in Franz's argument to say that that is not the location, the region, the area that Paul was pointing to. In fact, unless we can show and demonstrate that Paul was pointing to someplace other than, again, the place that the Septuagint, Philo, and Josephus all recognized, the Jewish contemporaries of Paul's day recognized it to be, then that's exactly where Paul was pointing to. If we can't demonstrate that he was pointing someplace else, then we have no argument. But, as I have stated, Franz, Hoffmeyer, or any of the other critics, they refuse to interact with these Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. They refuse to even acknowledge them. They don't interact with them. They don't even acknowledge them because once you do, you go, wait a minute, obviously Paul would have been in agreement with them. I mean, and again, if he wasn't, we have zero historical evidence. So they, first of all, they ignore much of the important evidence that are very very pertinent to this discussion. And then they sort of make these little rhetorical statements. They're like a rhetorical sleight of hand. It's like a card trick. You go, oh yeah, maybe Paul was pointing to that area of northwest Saudi Arabia if he was looking at a map from the 1990s. Yeah, of course, it was not called Saudi Arabia, but we're still dealing with the same location. So it's a dumb statement is the point. And it's the only purpose is to throw truth seekers off of the trail of truth. Likewise, Egyptologist, lecturer, and author David Roll, he agrees. And again, this is just straight up what I call academic intellectual bullying. This is just straight up bullying. He says that anyone who suggests that Paul was not referring to the Sinai Peninsula, their argument is, quote, complete nonsense. So this is the type of language where you don't have a good argument. You have no historical argument. You have no biblical argument. And so therefore, you just sort of, puff up your intellectual chest and call anyone who disagrees with you, just sort of condescendingly mock it. And then unless someone has a lot of confidence, they're really well studied and well researched, they look at someone who's written books and who's a lifelong Egyptologist and they go, oh gosh, I must not know what I'm talking about here. And they don't dare to challenge it. And it's this condescending, scholarly type of attitude that unfortunately I encounter too frequently when individuals are insecure. Rather than just laying out the case, they use this type of rhetoric. Again, some people use the rhetorical sleight of hand. Other people use rhetorical, again, academic bullying. So how then are we to determine, how are we as just lay people who are not scholars, but again, intelligent people who have the ability to think for ourselves, how are we to understand Paul's statement when he says that Mount Sinai is in Arabia? Now, I've already touched on some of the reasons, but first and foremost, Paul's understanding of Arabia, and I think we can all agree on this, would have first and foremost been informed by the fact that he was a first century, very Old Testament, devout Jew. He was a very Old Testament literate Jew. He was very well acquainted with the Old Testament, with the Bible. And his worldview would have first and foremost been informed and shaped and fashioned by his identity as a Jew, someone whose worldview is primarily determined by the Bible. That's the first thing that would have formed Paul's mind. That's the first issue to which his allegiance was given to. Okay, second, in Paul's day, and this is important, just in terms of from a biblical perspective, from the perspective, again, of a first century Jew living in Israel, as well as the ideas that were common because of the Greco-Roman ideas that were common throughout the ancient world at that time. The term Arabia in Paul's day had a range and a variety of meanings. And this is important. So when I said we're going to dig a little bit below the surface to say, well, in Paul's day, Arabia included the Sinai Peninsula. That's true. It's kind of true. It's kind of not true. We need to sort of unpack that a little bit more. So in Paul's day, there was a spectrum. There was a range which people could understand the term Arabia. Now, I'm going to use this analogy in modern times so that we can all understand exactly what I'm saying. In modern times, the word America has a range of meanings. Now, if I were to say to you, God bless America, or the incredibly hot-button phrase, make America great again, anyone living in our context today understands that both of those statements are referring specifically to the United States. However, anybody who is halfway educated who lives in modern times, they also recognize the fact that Canada is part of North America. Thus, Canada is technically part of America, as is Mexico part of, I guess this is still North America, but then you have Central America, and then you have South America, right? So we could be talking about, when we say America, we could be talking about Brazil. We could be talking about Argentina. We could be talking about El Salvador or Ecuador. Any number of different countries are part of America, and they are sort of under this heading of America. However, there is a very specific way in which America is used, and that's most often with regard to the United States. Okay, so when you just say America, your first go-to is not to say Mexico. Your first go-to is not to say, well, he must be talking about Costa Rica. He said America. He must be talking. Anybody who says anything otherwise, it's complete nonsense. right? No one in our time who understands the context of the way language is used, the way this term is used today, would recognize a reference of America as obviously referring to Costa Rica as complete nonsense. They would say, no, actually, the claim that it's complete nonsense is itself complete nonsense. Most often it's referring to the United States. However, technically, America does refer to all of these other places. So in the same way, Arabia in Paul's day had a range of meanings. And we're going to discuss this different range of meanings, and then we're going to try to zero in on what Paul most likely meant. Now, here's the thing. You cannot simply just choose one of these various meanings and say, this must be what Paul said, unless you have some reasons. Okay, so for all of the critics who just demand that Paul was referring to Sinai, I go, okay, you're making an assertion. Now you have to back your assertion up. You have to give some reasons, some explanations, other than the fact that you believe that's where Mount Sinai is, and therefore Paul must be agreeing with you. That's not logical. That's not a good argument. You have to give historical, contextual, or biblical arguments in terms of why that's where Paul was referring to. And the problem is none of the critics do that. None of the critics ever do that. What they do is they will cite various Greco-Roman historians to simply sort of reiterate the fact that Arabia had a range of meanings in Paul's day. The problem is we agree with that. That's not something we disagree with. What we disagree with is the second part of their argument, which is therefore, hence, this is what Paul clearly was referring to. No, it is not hence. It is not therefore. Okay. So let's look at some of the primary different ways that the term Arabia could have been and would have been understood by Paul the Apostle, and then we'll discuss how he was most likely using the term. So the first way that Arabia could have been used is in a very, very, very general, broad way. Okay, so it is simply as a reference to the East. Arabs, or Arabia, as a general reference to the East, so to the areas of the Middle East, to the east of Israel. So where do we get historical evidence that this is one way in which the term was used? Well, it's in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, we find a reference, Acts chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, a reference to the fact that Jews of the diaspora, Jews of the dispersion, Jews who were living outside of Israel in the dispersion, that they had come back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. Okay, so Acts 2 verses 9 through 11, we have all of these Jews as well as proselytes. As we'll see, these are Gentiles who had then converted to or were practicing Judaism. They had made pilgrimage back to Jerusalem. And so it then lists all of the peoples that were there. It lists all of the peoples there. And the list begins by listing specifically those from the east. And so first it mentions Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia. Okay, so what are we talking about? Again, most people today, they hear all these terms. They go, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, this means nothing to me. Okay, Parthians are those who lived in the empire of Parthia. Basically, they were Persians. Parthians, Persians. The word is actually related. So they were those that lived in modern day, loosely the modern day nation of Iran, Republic of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran. But in that part of the world, that would be the Parthians. Then the Medes would largely be considered the peoples that lived in the area today that is Kurdistan. So let's just say loosely northern Iraq, northern Iran, northern Syria. Okay, it extends a bit into eastern Turkey as well. But the area today that's considered Kurdistan, that's primarily where the Medes would have lived. And then the Elamites are those that lived in the southwest portion of modern-day Iran. So this is the area to the east of Babylon and Basra, southern Iraq, over there in that southern province of ancient Persia. Okay, that's the Elamites. And then also residents of Mesopotamia. Again, this is basically modern-day Iraq, Baghdad and south all the way down to the Persian Gulf. So it's Jews of the dispersion who were living in the Middle East. They were living in that part of the world, as well as Gentile proselytes, converts who had come over and were giving themselves to Judaism. They were now in Jerusalem. So it lists these peoples. Okay, then It says, and then there were those from Judea. Okay, so the locals, the Jews from Judea itself. And then finally, it lists Jews of the Western diaspora. Okay, those from the West. And it lists those from Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya and Cyrene, as well as visitors from Rome. So when it says Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, it's talking about Asia Minor. It's talking about modern-day Turkey. Okay, those who lived up there in Asia Minor, as well as Egypt. Again, that's loosely Egypt. Districts of Libya, that would have been northern Africa, North Africa. So not just the modern-day nation of Libya, but Tunisia and so forth. All of those areas to the west of Egypt. And visitors from Rome, of course, the boot, Italy. So first it lists those from the east, then it lists those from the west. Of course, it throws those from Judea in the middle. And then it specifies, it says both Jews and proselytes, again, so both ethnic Jews as well as Gentiles who had converted. And then finally, it wraps it all up and it summarizes the whole list. And it does so by using two words and two very simple categories. It says both Cretans and Arabs. What does it mean, Cretans and Arabs? Well, the term Cretan is the very general word that was used to refer to those from the Western diaspora, whereas Arabs is the term that it used for all of those that lived to the east. Now, they weren't Arabs, they were Jews. They were largely ethnic Jews, and again, some proselytes. But because these were Jews of the Eastern diaspora who lived in, again, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Kurdistan, and so forth, it calls them Arabs. They're from Arabia. Those from Cretia or whatever, from Crete. Those from Crete and those from Arabia. And it uses these words in a very, very general sense to refer to anyone who lived to the east of Israel. So that's the first very, very broad way. We have a biblical example that the word Arab could have possibly been understood in Paul's day. Okay, the second way, which is also a very broad use of the term, however, it was a way in which Arab or Arabia could have been used. And this is the way that when I give the example of saying, well, Brazil or Argentina or Panama or Costa Rica or this sort of thing, when we're talking about America, it's used in a very broad sense, but not the more restrictive, specific sense referring to the United States. This is what we're talking about here. Again, it's quite broad, and essentially this is any place outside of Israel where ethnic Arabs lived, where peoples that were understood to be Arabs. Now, by the way, Arabs, it's an interesting history of who are the Arabs. Well, essentially, from a biblical perspective, they are the mixed descendants of the Ishmaelites and the Edomites and the various eastern peoples. There was this command that was given in the Bible, do not go and mix. Don't intermarry with the pagans of the desert. Don't intermix with the Ishmaelites. Don't intermix with the Edomites. Don't intermarry. Rather, there was to be sort of a purity of the ethnic lines back in that day. And specifically, the reason was because if you do, then they will mislead you and you'll end up worshiping their gods. You're to remain within the family of true, pure worship of Yahweh, the God of the Bible. Don't intermarry with those that are worshiping the foreign ancient Near Eastern war and astral deities, right? However, as the biblical record tells us, the Ishmaelites, the Edomites, and the various peoples, they did intermix. And thus the word Arab in Aramaic as well as Hebrew and in many ways in Arabic, the word Arab actually means mixed. And so even in Arabic today, for instance, a car, an automobile, would be called an arava, like the wheels spin. It's like a blender. It goes around. It's mixing, right? And so the Arabs, it was a term that was used really for the mixed desert peoples. It was a fairly broad term. It's not a real restrictive ethnic term. It has come to be a bit more of an ethnic term, but essentially, historically, if we're going back to the origins of the Arab peoples, they were the mixed ones. So when we say that Arabia was a term that could be used at times very broadly of any place outside of Israel where ethnic Arabs lived, this is what we're referring to, is really even the term ethnic Arab was a fairly broad term. So we want to even be careful there and not overly restricting the way in which this term would have been used. So as an example, Gordon Franz cites a few different Greek historians who refer to the areas, for instance, of Lebanon, Syria, and the Golan Heights as Arabia. And he cites these Greek historians who are talking about Alexander the Great, because they were Alexandrian Greek historians. He talks about Alexander the Great fighting Arabs up there, and again, in the areas of Lebanon, Syria, and Mount Hermon, the Golan Heights. And so, this is just an example, and Franz is right. We agree with him. At times, people from this period would have referred to Arabs, Arabia. Now think about this. You look at a map of Israel. North of Israel is Lebanon. On the coastal side, that's Lebanon. And then Syria sort of is north of Lebanon, wraps all the way around there to Israel's northeast, that whole area. And then Mount Hermon sits right there at the modern-day border of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. And so he goes up there, people that Alexander the Great was fighting, those were Arabs. They were in Arabia. So this is just one example. Now, in the same way, this is the same way that Hoffmeyer, Franz, and Roll, and any other critics usually will argue that Paul would have been using it, and he would have then therefore been referring to Sinai. And we agree that part of the Sinai would have been referred to as Arabia in Paul's day. We, in fact, find some examples in history where people refer to a mountain in Sinai, and they call it the Arabian Mountain. Okay, it's in Arabia. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. Again, we're going to sort of drill down and unpack that a little bit more, but we agree with that. We agree with the idea that the term Arabia could be used in a very broad way at times. And then finally, the other way, and this is the most common way in which Arabia would have been used in Paul's day. And this is the way when I said, God bless America, make America great again. We're off to see America. Most often when you use these phrases, almost everyone understands them to be referring to, we'll say America proper. America, the home of the free, land of the brave, home of the free, or is it the other way around? In any case, the other way in which Arabia would have been used in Paul's day was specifically for Arabia proper. And there would have been in Arabia proper, the ancient homeland of the Arabs in Paul's day. And this specifically would have been the Arabian Peninsula, again, which correlates to the modern-day kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the various emirates and so forth, right? Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Yemen and all of these, the whole Arabian Peninsula would have, Yemen's not part of the Emirates, but all of the various nations that make up the Arabian Peninsula, that the Arabian Peninsula would have been understood as Arabia. First and foremost, that would have been the go-to understanding. And second, it also included some of the deserts that are to the south and to the east of Israel, which today are the southernmost edges of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So the southwestern desert of Jordan, it's the Transjordan, which means to the east of the Jordan, to the east of the Dead Sea, and south of Israel. That area would have been considered Arabia in Paul's day. So it would have been southern Jordan down into Saudi Arabia. That was the primary way that Paul and all of his contemporaries would have understood the term Arabia. Now, how is it that that term began? Where did it come from? Well, first of all, it begins with the Bible, and we're going to take some time to look at how the Bible would have understood the term Arabia. But also, when we look at the writings, for instance, of all of these Greco-Roman historians and geographers that the critics love to so frequently cite, they also began by recognizing that Arabia, first and foremost, pointed to the Arabian Peninsula. So we're going to look at a map. This is the world according to Herodotus. Herodotus is sometimes referred to as the father of modern history, the father of history. He wrote in about the middle of the 5th century, so roughly around 450. And based on his writings, various map makers have created maps of the world according to Herodotus. And so here, if you're watching the video, is a picture of the world according to Herodotus. And if you notice, the whole Arabian Peninsula is called Arabia. Anything to the north, which would have been included Jordan today, that's called Syria. Anything to the east would have been called Babylon. So in Herodotus's day, Arabia was not Mesopotamia. It was not Iraq. It was not Jordan or Lebanon or Syria or any of those things. Arabia in Herodotus's day was the Arabian Peninsula. Also in the writings of Strabo, he was a Greek historian and geographer who lived in the 1st century BC, so about 350 years or so after Herodotus. He then sort of breaks up the world that's known as Arabia into two separate provinces, if you will. And this came about because of the Greek occupation of the Middle East, and they sort of break up the Hellenistic world into various satrapies. These are various provinces. These are different Greek provinces, if you will. And so if we look at a map according to the world of Strabo, we see that he referred to the Arabian Peninsula as Arabia Felix. This means the happy or the blessed or the prosperous Arabia. But he also referred to that area that was just north of modern-day Saudi Arabia, again, the southern Jordanian desert. He referred to that as Arabia Deserta, the Arabian desert. Okay, so he sort of breaks it up now. And interestingly, he also refers to the Red Sea as the Arabian Gulf. Now, I'm going to make a point here that's really important. When you looked at both of these maps, when you look at the world according to Herodotus, you look at the world according to Strabo, you look at the world according to any of these geographers from this period, none of them have the Sinai Peninsula. None of them recognize, none of them even knew that the Sinai Peninsula existed. They all combine the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, as well as the Gulf of Suez, the two bodies of water that are on either side of this pie-shaped Sinai Peninsula, and they conflate them into one. So you just have on one side, you have the Arabian Peninsula, and then you have Africa. And there's no big peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula, in between, as we know today exists. So this is a glaring, huge idiosyncrasy of ancient Greco-Roman geography. We need to acknowledge that they didn't even know that the Sinai Peninsula existed. So when people say, as a lot of these critics do, they go, oh, you know, in Paul's day, all of the Sinai Peninsula would have been understood to be part of Arabia. That's not really true, because you can't say that because they didn't even know that the Sinai Peninsula existed. So it's like a completely, it's either an incredibly ignorant, historically ignorant comment, or again, it's intended to be misleading. Okay, so that's just an important point that we need to make. Then in the 2nd century, this is interesting, in the 2nd century AD, so now we're moving up to about 100 years after Paul, Claudius Ptolemy, he's now a Roman geographer and astronomer and astrologer and all kinds of different things. These guys were interesting back then. He, now stepping beyond Strabo, he actually designates 3 separate provinces, and he refers to these 3 separate provinces as Arabia, different types of Arabia. First of all, you have the Arabian Peninsula. Again, he continued to call that Arabia Felix. He moves the areas far out more to the east, again, pushing toward Iraq and so forth, as that he called that Arabia Deserta. And then the area there in southern Jordan, he referred to that as Arabia Petraea, which is interesting because it's close to the area today in southern Jordan known as Petra. Okay, so Arabia Petraea. Petra, of course, being that ancient Nabatean kingdom with all of the awesome buildings. Indiana Jones went there and so forth. And so these are the 3 terms. So here's a map from Claudius Ptolemy. And as you can see, if you're watching the video, I've drawn a red circle, Arabia Felix. That is the area of the Arabian Peninsula. Then there you have Arabia Deserta, which is sort of that area over there toward Iraq, extending all the way down to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And then he had Arabia Petraea. And again, that is the area of the southern Jordan. Okay, so in all of these, even Claudius, he still doesn't have the Sinai Peninsula. He still does not have the Sinai Peninsula. And he definitely does not call whatever you could look at his map and say might be the Arabian Peninsula. He does not call it Arabia. Okay, so this is very important. So here we are with such a range of possible meanings. Okay, so Paul, you go, okay, so here's Paul. In Paul's day, was he using the term Arabia to refer to the Arabian Peninsula, like Arabia proper, like i.e., God bless America? Was he using it in the most common, most obvious way? Or was he using it just very, very, very broadly? Okay, or even more broadly, like anywhere out to the east, right? These are our 3 options. Now, as I've said, in order to zero down on any one of these, we need to give a historical reason beyond simply the fact that, well, I'm looking for one that validates my argument in terms of where Mount Sinai is, okay? Because that's circular reasoning. That's just, you're just making an argument because it validates your argument, but you're not giving a reason. So what is our reason for believing that Paul likely, when he said Arabia, would have been referring to Arabia proper? Well, first of all, because he didn't qualify it. He didn't qualify it. He didn't say Arabia over here. He just pointed to Arabia, and so we can assume that he was using it as it would have been most commonly understood in his day. That's the first reason. The second reason is because, as I have stated multiple times, because the common tradition and understanding of his day, the Jewish traditions and then the Christian traditions that would come shortly thereafter, they all understood, because Paul mentions Mount Sinai, they specifically understood Mount Sinai to be in the area of Arabia proper, modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia, just outside of the town or the city of Midian. So those are two reasons why that's where Paul was most likely pointing to, because we have no reason to believe that he suspected that Mount Sinai was someplace else. And if he did, he most certainly never qualified it, which would be very suspect. Third, and this is so important, is the context of what Paul is talking about when he makes this statement. How do we interpret the Scriptures rightly? We determine the context. We determine the immediate context. We understand the broader biblical context. We have to determine context of any passage before we determine and interpret its meaning. So let's go ahead and let's actually read his comments. Okay, so in Galatians 4, we're going to read verse 22 through 23, and then we're going to actually skip forward to verses 28 through 30. So again, just to sort of shorten it, and right in the middle of that is when Paul says Mount Sinai is in Arabia. So beginning in verse 22, Paul says this, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman, one by the slave woman, one by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise." Skipping forward, he says, "And you, brethren, you brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. But as at that time, in the same way that at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. But what do the Scriptures say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman." So, what is Paul talking about here? Well, as usual, Paul is making a very nuanced, sometimes a very complicated, a very subtle Jewish, midrashic, even rabbinic argument. He's appealing to other traditions and other concepts and ideas within Scripture. He makes a very intertextual argument. But clearly, Paul, in the middle of this, when Paul goes, Mount Sinai is in Arabia, he is not making just some dry geographic statement based on the possible usage of the term by Greco-Roman historians. Paul is making a thoroughly biblical argument. He's making a very spiritual argument. He's making a very scriptural argument. It doesn't get any more spiritual, scriptural, biblical than this, right? So that's the first point. And so when Paul says Mount Sinai is in Arabia, we need to understand his statement in the context of what he's talking about. What is he talking about? He's talking about Hagar. He's talking about Abraham. He's talking about Ishmael. He's talking about their ancient homeland. That's the whole context of his discussion. Okay, so after Ishmael was kicked out of Abraham's camp, Hagar and Ishmael were kicked out, where did they come to settle? What is the land of Ishmael? What part of the world are we talking about? Well, Genesis 21, the very same chapter that Paul just quotes when he says, cast out the bondwoman, in verses 20 through 21, tell us that Ishmael came to settle in the desert, or the wilderness of Paran. Okay, Paran is understood most commonly to be in that area of southern Jordan, and then the areas extending down into Saudi Arabia. But what else does the Bible say? Well, Ishmael's first son, Nebaioth, he's the father of the first century Arabs known as the Nabateans. They had this great kingdom, again, pretty close to Paul's day, and that extended roughly from Petra, again in southern Jordan, all the way down to Maidin Salah. This is like 400 plus miles or so down into Saudi Arabia. That whole area of southern Jordan, northwestern Saudi Arabia, that is where the descendants of Ishmael, that is where the Ishmaelites came to settle. That is where Paul would have understood geographically, biblically, the land of Arabia to have been. Again, the children of Ishmael, the Nabateans and so forth, these are the peoples that are looked to primarily as the modern-day ancestors of the modern-day Arabs. Kedar, what about Ishmael's second son, Kedar? He was identified as having lived to the east and slightly to the south of Israel in the southern part of modern-day Jordan. Duma settled in the area now known as Dumat el-Jendel in Saudi Arabia, 400 miles into Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this is not just like right on the border, well into Saudi Arabia. Tema, another very well-known son of Ishmael. Where did he come to settle? He settled in an oasis located 400 miles north of Medina in Saudi Arabia, again in northwest Saudi Arabia. So overwhelmingly, Ishmael and his descendants came to settle in this whole area down there in southern Jordan, northwest Saudi Arabia. So this is the third reason that's where Paul was pointing to. So the first reason, really, we could say this is the first reason, is the context of Paul's statements. Second, we have the broader historical context of Paul's statements, i.e., the Jewish traditions which place Mount Sinai there outside of the town of Midian or Al-Bad. There's no reason to believe that Paul would have held to anything other than that. Third, again, as I pointed out, that the common go-to understanding of the term Arab or Arabia in Paul's day would have been that part of the world, and that the other places, outside of the Arabian Peninsula, that was, required a little more qualification. Again, just like we might say, it's nice to visit the Americas, or, Canada is part of North America. It's sort of an exceptional use of the term as it is commonly understood. So we've just laid out three reasons why Paul was pointing to northwest Saudi Arabia, whereas the critics cannot point out a single reason why Paul would have been referring to Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so we've dealt pretty good with Paul's statement there in chapter 4, Galatians 4, verse 25. However, I want to drill down a little bit more, and I want to highlight this issue of the Greek misconceptions concerning the Sinai Peninsula, because this is an important and very interesting historical part of the discussion. Franz, for example, Gordon Franz, cites Herodotus, and this is what he says. Franz says, quote, Herodotus's description would therefore include all of the Sinai Peninsula in Arabia of his day. Okay, so first he says that the Sinai Peninsula would have been included in Arabia, but he cites Herodotus as his source. What we've already seen by looking at the map is that Herodotus didn't even know the Sinai Peninsula existed. Now, some artists will add this little teeny nub, acting, but the thing of it is there's nothing in the writings of Herodotus to show that he believed. He combines, as I said, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez. He shows no evidence in his writings of having any awareness that the Sinai Peninsula even existed. As I said, it goes directly from the Arabian Peninsula over to Africa. The same is the case with Strabo. The same is the case with Claudius Ptolemy. This is a glaring, huge problem with Greco-Roman geography. Okay, we have to acknowledge this reality. We can't just say, well, all of the Greco-Roman geographers believed that Sinai was part of Arabia because, again, they didn't know it existed. However, what does the Bible say? Okay, so we can try to, manipulate history and use some really bad, faulty facts. Make some faulty statements, or we can turn to what the Bible says. And as we have already pointed out, the Bible clearly places the border of Egypt over there to the east of the central part of the Sinai Peninsula at Wadi al-Arish. So if you're watching the video, we've got a map up here. Again, Wadi al-Arish is this It's this inlet where, there's a river that runs out to the Mediterranean, and it's, I don't know, maybe 100 miles or so to the west of the border of modern-day Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. But again, it's way over there on the east of the Sinai Peninsula. The Bible repeatedly refers to that as the border of Egypt. What that means is that the border of Egypt goes from there. We don't know exactly where the border of Egypt goes, but it's loosely works its way through the Sinai Peninsula. So the point is this: much of the Sinai Peninsula was considered to be part of Egypt. Okay, so the biblical framework for the Sinai Peninsula is that much of it was part of Egypt, not Arabia. It's just the opposite of what the critics tried to say. And so that's sort of the Sinai Peninsula from a biblical perspective. From an archaeological perspective, we have clear evidence that the Egyptians, back during the time of the Exodus, controlled most of the Sinai Peninsula. They had copper mines. There's all sorts of evidences of Egyptian presence throughout the Sinai Peninsula. So rather than viewing the Sinai Peninsula as completely part of Arabia, we should view it as this sort of vague no man's land that was partially controlled by Egypt, partially controlled or viewed as part of Arabia. That's probably the fairest way to view it. But such blanket statements that go, all of the Sinai Peninsula was viewed as being part of Arabia, it's simply not the case biblically. Again, the Bible places the border of Egypt there at Wadi al-Arish, the brook of Egypt, and even archaeologically we can look back and see that throughout much of Egyptian history, they controlled much of the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so now we're going to shift to this other statement. So we've demonstrated the fact that most likely, we can't demonstrate it absolutely, but most likely, the most reasonable option of the three options is that Paul viewed Mount Sinai to be down there in northwest Saudi Arabia, outside of the town or the city of Midian. Okay, now what about Galatians 1? What about Paul's statement when he says that after his conversion, he didn't consult man, he didn't consult flesh, rather he went to Arabia, i.e. to consult God? Is there a chance that Paul himself visited Mount Sinai? And I would argue that looking at the context of Paul's statement in Galatians 1, that it is very likely and even most likely that that's exactly what happened. So let's go ahead and read the fuller context of Galatians 1, verses 11 through 17. Paul says this, he says, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me is not according to man." What is he saying? He goes, I didn't receive it from flesh. I didn't receive it from man. I received it, i.e., from God. He says, "For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it. But I received it through a revelation, i.e. from God, of Jesus Christ," a revelation of Jesus Christ. "For you have heard of my former manner of life." Now he starts highlighting his former life. He says, "My manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure, and I even tried to destroy it. I got straight up street cred among the Judaizers, among the Jews. I was trying to destroy the Christians. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when God, who had set me apart from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles," he goes, "So when I had this encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, when Jesus knocked me on my keister, I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't go to consult the apostles. I didn't get my full understanding of the gospel from man. No. He goes, listen, I was a devout Jew. I was extremely zealous for Judaism and the traditions of my ancestors, my Jewish ancestors. He goes, so when I had this encounter, I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't consult the apostles. Instead, I went to Arabia." He says, I went away to Arabia. Okay, so we have three interpretive options here. The first is that Paul, he went and preached in Arabia. Again, just vaguely, could have been in Iraq. We really don't know. He went to Arabia to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. We have no record of what happened there. We don't have any record in the book of Acts. There's no historical record. There's no historical evidence. But that is one interpretive option in terms of what Paul was saying. And in commentaries, you'll see some people who will argue that Paul was preaching to the Gentiles. Again, we have no evidence other than this. Second, some people will say, well, Paul, he didn't go to Jerusalem, but rather he went away into the desert. to seek God, just vaguely into the desert. He just needed some time away, and he was seeking the Lord in the desert. Now, that's the second option. The third option is that when he says Arabia, and again, this is the only place in the New Testament where the term Arabia is used. These two places, again, in the book of Acts, you have references to Arabs. These are the only two examples where we have Arabia. Paul makes them both in the same letter. So when Paul says, look, I didn't consult flesh, I didn't consult the apostles, I received it by the Lord himself taught it to me. So when this Damascus Road encounter happened, I didn't go to man, I went to Arabia. The clear inference, in my opinion, is that he's saying, I went to seek God, not flesh. Where did he go to seek God? In Arabia, i.e., which he mentions a couple chapters later, is where Mount Sinai is. Okay, and so in all likelihood, based on the context of just the information that we have here in Galatians chapter 1, in all likelihood, he didn't just vaguely go in the desert, that he went specifically to the original location of the original revelation, of the revelation of Torah, of the law, that he had been giving himself to so zealously up until that point in his life. Jesus flips his world upside down, and he goes, wait a minute. Jesus says, hey, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he goes, Lord, wait a minute, I'm persecuting God, and you're Yeshua. Everything was upside down. He went to the location where the revelation originally happened, where God came down, and he sought the God that he had so zealously served all of his life. And it was there, in all likelihood, again, we can't establish this with any certainty, but I would argue that it is the most reasonable, the most contextually rooted option of the three interpretive options, that he went to Mount Sinai to listen to God, to hear from God directly, to ask God, what is this all about? And it is there at Mount Sinai, like Elijah before Paul. Again, there is clear biblical Jewish precedent for going to Mount Sinai to seek refuge with God. And so in all likelihood, Paul did what Elijah did. He went to Mount Sinai. And he listened for the voice of God there, for God to speak, because that's exactly what happened with Elijah. God spoke in the still small voice. And it's there that the Lord revealed the fullness of the gospel to Paul. Is it possible that he was just out in the desert somewhere? Yeah, it's possible. But again, I think the context of everything that Paul's saying here points to the fact that he went to Mount Sinai. And then I'll make this statement, which will be probably a bit controversial, but it was at Mount Sinai. It was at Mount Sinai that the Lord revealed to Paul the fullness of his gospel. And it's also at Mount Sinai where the Lord personally revealed to Paul that Mount Sinai is no longer the holy, sacred, cosmic mountain. Rather, Zion, rather Jerusalem, is the new cosmic mountain for the Jewish people, because that is the mountain where Yeshua, the one who knocked Saul on his rear end, that it is Yeshua who will rule the earth. He will rule the nations from Mount Zion in the same way that God had come down on Sinai in fire, in glory, in clouds with the trumpets. He will come again in the form of his son, Yeshua, with the trumpets, in the clouds, with an earthquake, and he will establish the throne of his father David on Mount Zion. And so in all likelihood, it was there at Sinai that God revealed to Paul that Sinai is no longer necessarily important. And that's why Paul goes on to talk about Sinai being in bondage. Sinai is in bondage, and he likens it to Hagar. Okay, so, again, down there in Arabia, down there where Hagar and Ishmael settled. And so, it's not a logical leap. It's not an unreasonable point to speculate and to say that in all likelihood, Paul did indeed go and seek the Lord and receive the fullness of his gospel there at Mount Sinai. Now, I'll just make this point. I tweeted this out just in very brief form. I don't know what Twitter gives you, 140 characters or something. And I threw this out. And my friend, Dr. Michael Heiser, challenged my statement. He said, this is completely illogical. And I was like, well, my goodness, this is a very common interpretive option. When you work through commentaries, you see commentators making this statement quite frequently. And in fact, I would argue it's the most reasonable. It's by far the most reasonable. I've worked through the arguments for the idea that he was preaching to the Gentiles. I've worked through the arguments in favor of just that he was out in the desert, and there's really no basis for that. But again, all of the context points to him going to Sinai. And so I cited several different commentators and historians and so forth, to which he responded. He said, well, but you need to cite some scholarly journals, to which I did cite scholarly journals, again, citing N.T. Wright He's not my favorite voice, but he is considered by many today to be the world's leading New Testament scholar in the world. And I cited an article where he is agreeing with me. So I just want to read a couple quotes from some different commentators, again, who validate and agree with the notion that Paul, in all likelihood, did go to Mount Sinai. Now, the first one is actually F.F. Bruce. He's the legendary Old Testament scholar. But I want to highlight the fact that Bruce actually doesn't agree that that's where Paul went, but he does agree that it's a very reasonable option. So F.F. Bruce says this. He says, "It is possible that in Arabia, Paul communed with God in the wilderness, where Moses and Elijah had communed with him centuries before." And then in the late 20th century commentary, Lang, he says this: "Paul's object in this residence in Arabia, as seems most probable from the context," again, I agree with him, "as seems most probable from the context, was not to preach the gospel, but to enjoy a season of undisturbed preparation for his high and holy calling." Alan Kirkeslager, he wrote an article, I've referenced him previously. He's a professor of ancient and comparative religions. He makes the statement. He says, "Paul, like many other Jews in this period, may have briefly gone into the desert to acquire revelation in conscious imitation of Moses and Elijah. The odd choice of Arabia for this quest is best explained if Paul actually went so far as to go to Mount Sinai." Again, I agree with Kirkeslager. And then here's a quote from N.T. Wright. I also cited when I was, in dialogue with this issue, J.B. Lightfoot, another sort of legendary commentator who agrees with this perspective. But here's a quote from N.T. Wright, again, legendary New Testament scholar. I disagree with him because he's a strong advocate of replacement theology. He's an amillennialist, and although he would say he doesn't espouse replacement theology, he does. He's a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant scholar. I disagree with him on those points, but he's a very pleasurable guy to read, and there are many things that he has written that I do actually enjoy. So here's his statement. "When stopped in his tracks by the revelation on the road to Damascus, he again did what Elijah did. He went off to Mount Sinai." Okay, and then finally, Wilfred Knox summarizes this whole issue quite nicely, and we'll wrap it up here. He says, "After his conversion, he retired from Damascus to Arabia. It was there that he worked out what was implied in the revelation of the risen Lord given to him on the road to Damascus." So he says, that which was given in seed form, that which was implied when Jesus first encountered him, had not yet been filled out, right? I love the way he articulates this. He says, by Arabia is meant the desert lying east and south of Palestine, the country of the Nabatean Arabs, again, the children of Nebaioth, the children of Ishmael. The region included Mount Sinai, the scene of God's original revelation of himself to the Jewish nation. St. Paul's journey to this region was not a missionary journey, but a retirement into solitude comparable to that of Elijah. Its purpose was to enable him to adjust his life and teaching to the new truth revealed to him, that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, not an impostor. In this sense, he had learned his gospel not from flesh and blood, i.e. from human teachers, but by the revelation which caused his conversion and his subsequent meditations on what that revelation implied. So I agree with Knox again that Paul, in all likelihood, went to Mount Sinai where the Lord completely finished the revelation that began when Jesus knocked him on his rear end on the road to Damascus. And so in all likelihood, Paul the Apostle agrees with the Jews of his time, as well as the Christian that came thereafter, that he viewed Mount Sinai as being outside of Midian, or the modern-day town of Al-Bad in northwest Saudi Arabia, and in all likelihood, Paul himself actually visited there and communed with God on Mount Sinai in modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia. Okay, so that's it for this class. In the next class, we're going to jump in and actually begin discussing the mountain of Jebel al-Lawz itself, and many of the unique topographical, geological, and geographic features of the mountain, and show how those things all line up perfectly with the biblical descriptions. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for being with us.